Hey guys, first of all, I just want to plug a new channel that some friends and I have made. It's a panel discussion format that we're uploading to about twice a week. So if you like this content, you can get more like it in a slightly different format on that channel, The Good Dudes Show, and I'll put a link down below. So check that out, subscribe, share it around. Definitely appreciate that. Thanks. Today I want to talk about stereotypes and discrimination. Now, the conventional wisdom or the standard narrative is that stereotypes are wrong, they're ignorant, they're a result of, people not knowing things or, having faulty cognition processes or faulty, information gathering processes or pattern detection processes. But one of the biggest secrets of recent times is that science has actually disproven this narrative. Serious studies are all the time showing that stereotypes tend to be accurate overall, overwhelmingly, and especially, social stereotypes that are shared between large numbers of people. Your brain is a pattern recognition machine, and since it's always working with incomplete information, it's going to get that wrong a good portion of the time. So, many of the stereotypes that individuals come up with are indeed wrong, but by the time you get to, shared stereotypes, social stereotypes that are widespread, that are persistent over time, those tend overwhelmingly to be accurate, although not always. And I'm going to explain why. So the reason this is true is because, stereotypes are an accurate way of, modeling and predicting the world, but only as a form of collective cognition. See, as an individual, they are indeed epistemically dubious. They're formed through confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is the tendency to believe things or to think things have been confirmed by our experience, even though our experience as individuals is never statistically representative. All of our individual experience is anecdotal. So that places limitations on its epistemic value. And second of all, this idea of confirming things probably has no epistemic value of its own. Because, the way that science advances, for example, is through disconfirmation, not through confirmation, not through induction, because David Hume pointed out the problem of induction like 400 years ago. So in science, we're not proving anything by induction or any other means. We're disproving bad hypotheses or bad theories or false theories. And that's how science advances, by process of elimination, by disproving, by disconfirming. And the reason for this is you can conclusively disprove something, with only a few pieces of information that it's possible to possess. So it's possible to gather enough disconfirming evidence to disprove a theory or a hypothesis conclusively, because you only need a few pieces of evidence to do that. Now, the truth of a proposition, on the other hand, depends on all of the evidence. And one problem with that is you never know how much evidence there is and how much of it you possess. You don't know what you don't know. So, because the truth of a proposition depends so much on those unknown unknowns, it can't be proven, it can't be confirmed in any definitive, conclusive way, like something can be disconfirmed. And that's why science advances through process of elimination, by conjecture and refutation, not by proving things, not by confirming things. So this confirmation bias is double dubious. First of all, because it's a justificationary approach, which is epistemically untenable, and second, because it relies on anecdotal evidence, which is statistically sketchy. So, how do stereotypes form? Well, it's kind of like a little bit like the scientific method, although on a much smaller scale and with many more limitations and caveats. So there's let's say a stereotype candidate, which is like a hypothetical stereotype, a hypothesis, a stereotypical hypothesis, right? So people either come up with stereotype candidates on their own, or they can be primed with stereotype candidates. Somebody will repeat a stereotype to them, and then they have to evaluate whether that stereotype seems true or not. And so, if it's something they come up on their own as a result of observing patterns in the real world, comparing their own personal experiences, from past to present, or if it's something that they hear from another source, once they're primed with that stereotype candidate, then if they're confronted with a situation subsequent to that, within a relatively short time span, to where that candidate is still somewhat in their mind or available for recall, then they'll consider that stereotype to have been confirmed. Now, a lot is made of the dubiousness of this confirmation bias, because it is epistemically dubious on an individual level. But what happens when these stereotypes start to spread through the population is that they attain a much higher degree of accuracy and certainty. Because I could be coming up with stereotype candidates all the time, stereotype hypotheses all the time, and some of them could be confirmed in my mind. We know that epistemically that's dubious, just by random chance. I might come up with a stereotype that, I don't know, gingers are calm and placid. And then I'll run into a calm, placid ginger who's like really mellow and laid back. And then that'll confirm the stereotype for me in my mind. And once it's confirmed, I'll have a tendency to believe that it's true. Now, maybe if I come up, after that, if I meet a bunch of, fiery, temperamental redheads in a row, then maybe I'll have to replace it with another stereotype. But for the time being, that will be confirmed just by the random chance occurrence of meeting that particular individual. And then, this stereotype having been confirmed, I'm going to repeat it to other people. And that's going to prime them to test this stereotype candidate, this stereotype hypothesis, against their immediate short-term experiences. And the thing is, if it's a good stereotype, if it's an accurate stereotype, then it will be confirmed by their experiences. It'll be confirmed by their experiences. They'll accept it as true, and they'll repeat it to others, and it'll start to spread. But if it's a bad stereotype candidate, if it's a false stereotype candidate, it won't be confirmed by their experiences. Or it might in a few cases, but not many. And so it'll peter out. It'll tend to die out. It'll be replaced by better stereotype candidates. And if there are conflicting stereotypes about the same subject, usually the better one will win. So what makes stereotypes accurate is not, the process by which they originate in one individual, but the process by which they spread through an entire population. And the better a stereotype is, in terms of the more accurate it is, the more predictive value it has, the faster and the further it'll spread and the longer it'll persist in a population of people with anecdotal experiences operating on confirmation bias. As sketchy as that is on an individual basis, the way that it causes stereotypes to spread through a population results in a high degree of accuracy and predictive value. So that standard narrative that stereotypes are false and ignorant and based on cognitive biases and defects, that's wrong. That's been disproven, and we can explain why it's wrong. The next argument people might make is that, well, okay, maybe they're accurate, but they don't make very good rules or heuristics for decision making, because this is one thing that like Steven Pinker and some of these classical liberals or based centrists are always saying is, there's more differences within groups than between groups. And so, there's overlapping distributions. So just saying that this group is different from this group on average isn't a good way to make decisions about individuals. And this is false, because quite often we're not looking for individuals from where the distributions overlap. We're looking for individuals from the extremes. And maybe the best example of this is like elite military units, elite military operators, I think people call them. And there's always this push to include women in these elite military units. And people always say, well, especially these based centrist types, well, if they can meet you don't have to decrease the standards. If they can meet the standards, just let them in. Maybe there are a few women who can meet the standards. And that's unlikely, first of all, because you're not talking about people from where the distributions overlap. Because there are some women who are stronger than some men, right? But they're not stronger than the strongest men. They're stronger than the weakest men. And there are some women who are more aggressive than some men, right? But they're not stronger than the most aggressive men. They're stronger than the least aggressive men. So you're not looking for people from where the distributions overlap. You're looking from people who are already on the extreme of the distribution. And for elite military units, you're looking for people who are basically elite level athletes, who are have an elite level of aggression, like they're extreme outliers on aggression and independence and also intelligence. And at least 3 out of 4 of those are like characteristically male traits. Where the male distribution is shifted, far to the side that we want compared to the female distribution. And the other one, intelligence, is shifted at least a little bit because males are more variable intelligence. So the further you get from average, the more males you're going to find. Now, 1 or 2 standard deviations above average, there's probably not going to be much difference still between males and females. But on those other dimensions, strength, aggression, independence, there's probably going to be quite a bit of difference between males and females on average. So if you're looking for people that are like extremely elite on 3 different dimensions, all of which favor males, like it's very unlikely that there are going to be any females or very many females. There might be 1 or 2 somewhere that would meet the minimum requirements, the minimum objective requirements for those roles. But the other thing is they're going to exceed them by less on average than the men who exceed them. Because if you have to struggle to find 1 or 2 women who meet the minimum standards, they're probably going to just barely meet them. But if there are a reasonable number of men who meet those standards, some of those men are going to exceed them by quite a bit. So even if you find a few females who are qualified for those roles in terms of like the minimum standards, you are, they're still not going to be your best candidates for those roles. They're probably going to be close to your worst candidates for those roles of all the candidates that are qualified. So you're not missing out on much by just saying no. And that may be the policy. In fact, it almost certainly is the policy that makes the most sense, is to just say no and not even consider them, because so many get injured in training and that's so costly and everything. And it's just a waste of time and energy and human resources and money and everything else to even let them try to assess their individual qualifications for that role. So that's an example where that overlapping distribution argument just doesn't apply. And people are always making variations of this argument that like it's still individual characteristics or individual criteria that are the most applicable in the most number of cases and not collective ones. And that's totally untrue, especially in cases where you are dealing with a collective. So like if you're trying to choose the best school to send your children, it's not only impractical but pointless to look at the individual merits and qualities of every student in that school, because a lot of work, a lot of trouble, and you're only going to end up with something resembling the statistical averages of those demographics that compose the student body of that school. So you're going to do all that work for nothing because you are dealing with a collective. So statistical criteria are relevant because that's what you're going to end up with in the end after you do all those individual evaluations. So if you're choosing, a school for your kids, you're choosing a neighborhood to live in, you're choosing a city to live in, etc., you're dealing with statistical values anyway. And so statistical criteria are perfectly relevant and perfectly applicable to making those kind of decisions. And by the way, like immigration would be an excellent example of this too, because yes, immigrants are individuals, but immigrants are also a collective. They're also a statistical sample, right? Because you're not just going to let in one immigrant. You're going to let in a bunch of them. And so statistical criteria start to become relevant there as well. And then there's an argument that it's unfair, to apply statistical criteria to decisions about individuals. This is like a classical liberal argument, an individualist argument. Classical liberals or centrists or conservatives or libertarians will often make this argument that it's unfair to judge an individual by, the conduct or the qualities of their group that they come from. And that fairness demands we give them an individual hearing and give them an individual evaluation and an individual decision. There probably is an extent to which it is unfair. You could say it's unfair. But there's also an extent to which it's unfair to say that we can't do that, because it's rational to do that in a great many cases. And it's rational to do that because it costs extra to use individual criteria, to use individual qualities, to make an individual determination than it does to use collective criteria or statistical criteria to make a heuristic determination. A heuristic is like a rule of thumb or a shortcut. It's not a complete algorithm where you're evaluating all the relevant details. It's just a quick decision. It costs extra to make an individual evaluation, an individual determination. And for certain groups where, their likelihood of providing some kind of positive value is, lower than normal, and their likelihood of being a cost or a danger is higher than normal, it might not be worth the extra cost of evaluating them individually before making a determination in each case, because that costs something. And there's also a risk because we could get it wrong. Like the bad ones, the dangerous ones, the costly ones, they're not necessarily going to tell us that they're the bad ones, they're the dangerous ones, they're the costly ones. And, their fellows might not necessarily tell us either. If they have some kind of like group solidarity or whatever, they're not necessarily going to tell us who the bad ones are. Before he shot up the Pulse nightclub, Omar Mateen sold his house to his sister for $1. So she knew something was up. She didn't tell anyone. How many times has that happened before? In the 9/11 case, there were 19 guys involved with that, as they say. How many other people were in the know? How many other people either supported that or knew about it to some extent but didn't say anything? It had to have been dozens, if not hundreds. So, the bad ones aren't necessarily going to tell us who they are, and the other ones, the good ones, aren't necessarily going to tell us who the bad ones are. So not only does it cost something to try to sort people into those two groups and make an individual evaluation, but we could still end up getting it wrong, and the bad ones get through. So there's a huge cost involved, and particularly for groups with a very low likelihood of providing some unique and positive value for us, it's just not worth it. So saying we have to treat them as individuals, we have to make an individual evaluation, we have to make an individual determination in every case, is saying we have to bear a cost for their benefit. We have to take a risk for their benefit, and the vast majority of them, in some cases, at least with some groups, are not going to be worth that cost or that risk. And so, however unfair it may be to make a determination about an individual based on a statistical, set of data about their group, however unfair that may be, it's just as unfair, if not more unfair, to say that we can't do that. Because that's saying that we have to take a risk and bear a cost for their benefit that may be a bad risk, or a cost with no return, with no corresponding benefit. And so that's unfair too. So, stereotypes are accurate, they're valid, they can have tremendous predictive value, they can be rational decision-making criteria, and all of the arguments about how they're false, how they're inaccurate, how they're unfair, how they don't yield good decisions, all of those arguments are flawed. And then the final thing is, well, there are some cases where stereotypes are inaccurate. So the way that stereotypes arise, while it's pretty good at yielding true models of the world that have predictive value and have value as decision-making criteria, it can be subject to error, and it can be subject to hacking. It can be manipulated. And one example of this is, in my last video, I talked about a bunch of cases where blacks attacked whites violently, sometimes fatally. Just in the last month and a month and a half, there are numerous cases of this, and that's true for any period of a month or a month and a half that you want to look at. And those cases, they'll often be in local news, but there's a very strong effort made to prevent those stories from reaching the national news. And if they do reach the national news, there's just as strong an effort made to scrub those stories of any racial content, to try and obscure, the racial identity of the perpetrator and the victim. And the reason for that is they're trying to prevent these stereotypes from forming. Well, it's a little bit too late in this case, because that stereotype already exists of that particular group being violent and dangerous. But they're trying to prevent that stereotype from being reinforced, from being spread further than it already has. And I would say pretty successfully, because, unless you live in a really dangerous area, that's still going to be a pretty infrequent local news story. And so just having it in the local news may happen in a small town. It may happen once a year, every couple of years, twice a year, but it's still not going to be frequent enough in many cases to cause that stereotype to become entrenched in people's minds, or some people's minds. Some people will have that stereotype anyway, but it's not going to be as widespread or as strong as it would be if these kind of stories were making the national news with some degree of frequency, because we can see that just such a stereotype has been created about police in America from a literal handful of stories. Maybe 2 handfuls of stories, maybe 3, over the last 7-8 years. So they've created this stereotype of police as violent, racist murderers, even though there's no statistical evidence for that stereotype, and there's plenty of evidence against it. They've created this stereotype just by repeating it in the national news a few times a year. And so that stereotype has become entrenched, and it's confirmed every time the national news repeats that narrative. They'll take the incident, they'll show the incident, they'll put it into the context of this narrative or this stereotype uncritically. And they won't examine the statistical data. They won't say that this is a rare occurrence. They won't say that, compared to how many crimes they commit, blacks are still not getting killed as often as other races. They won't put any of the, critical arguments against this stereotype up in the story. They'll just repeat the stereotype. They'll repeat the false narrative, reinforcing it, and that's a confirmation in people's minds that the stereotype is true. And they only have to do this a few times a year to keep this stereotype entrenched for a large number of people, even though it is false. Statistically speaking, it is false. At the same time, they're preventing that stereotype from forming, about the group who are supposedly being victimized in the false narrative about cops. They're preventing that same stereotype from arising for that group or being reinforced or entrenched for that group by preventing stories of their violence from rising to national news. And in most jurisdictions, that's going to be effective because it's rare enough on a local level that the local news can report it without creating that stereotype. But if the national news did, oh man, it would be it'd be going back to the 1920s or something in terms of people's attitudes about this particular group. And so that's an example of how the stereotype process can be hacked, both to prevent the formation of a stereotype or to limit its spread, limit its extent, and also to create false stereotypes, false narratives, and reinforce them through this confirmation bias. So it is still important that these kind of shenanigans aren't tolerated, and that we can control the spread of information and not allow that information to be controlled by hostile groups who want to prevent us from adopting stereotypes that would be rational for us to adopt and force us to adopt stereotypes that aren't rational, that aren't true, that don't produce good decisions. And so that's a caveat to the whole stereotype thing. We still have to be careful because even though stereotypes in general are pretty true, and it's a surprisingly effective way to model and predict the world, it's still subject to manipulation. It's still something we have to be careful about because it is still something that can produce bad results, either unintentionally or in this case, intentionally. It's being manipulated intentionally. So, once again, thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed the content. Check out my new channel, The Good Dudes Show. It's a panel discussion with some friends of mine and I that we do regularly. So come on by and check us out there. Thanks. Bye.